Okay, so our podcast for standard 6.4. In this standard, we're going to be taking a look at how different kinds of elements and nutrients get cycled throughout our ecosystems. So we are going to do a brief description of the water cycle, and then we'll take a more in-depth look at the carbon cycle, especially the relationship between photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And then finally, we'll take a look at the nitrogen cycle and the role that bacteria play in this very important cycle. So some of the things that we're going to be learning about are like denitrification and nitrogen fixation and things that have to happen to nitrogen in order for our bodies to be able to use it in order to make our proteins. So all matter has to be cycled throughout ecosystems, and we call these cycles biogeochemical cycles. The bio is for the cycling through living things. The geo is cycling through the earth, and the chemicals are the things that are being cycled. So elements, chemicals, and matter get passed from one organism to another and to different parts of the biosphere. So we already know we obtain energy from eating things, but we also obtain nutrients from eating things. And we put those nutrients back into the environment through waste most of the time, or when decomposition happens and things like that. So those are all parts of the biogeochemical cycles that are essential for the earth to survive. So we're going to start with the water cycle. This is the continuous cycling of water throughout the biosphere. Most people have learned about the water cycle in elementary school. So anytime, remember that we're talking about a cycle, you always are thinking this is kind of like a circular process. So I'm going to pick a starting point. We're going to go from there. But it always comes back around. So for the water cycle, you can start with evaporation. Okay, so evaporation is taking water, and basically in evaporation you're going to go from liquid water to gas, and that gas is going to end up going into the air. Okay, so evaporation is liquid to gas, and then transpiration is when water gets evaporated from plants. From evaporation, the water gas will go up into the air, and through condensation, this is where you're going to make your clouds. And in those clouds, you will be basically going backwards, and you're going to go from gas to liquid. Once you get to that liquid part, the precipitation will happen. Precipitation can happen in the form of rain or sleet or snow or any of those types of things. Precipitation falls to earth, and sometimes it will run off down mountains and into rivers and things. Sometimes seepage happens, and this is where it gets soaked up down into the water, into the soil. And then uptake is where that water could then end up back inside of the plants because they take it up through their roots. So the uptake is something that's going to happen through the roots of plants. And then we go back from here back to the evaporation or transpiration, depending on what you are. The evaporation would be going from the large rivers and bodies of water. Transpiration would be happening from the plants. Okay, so this is a simple diagram showing you this. So here's the evaporation from the large body of water and transpiration from the plants. Condensation happens in the cloud. The clouds get enough liquid water. Precipitation happens. Some of that precipitation is going to run off into the bodies of water, and some of it will seep into the ground, picking up groundwater, and that can be taken back up through the roots of the plants, and then the cycle happens all over again. All right, the next cycle we're going to take a look at is the carbon-oxygen cycle. Sometimes it's called just the carbon cycle, but really oxygen is cycled in the same manner. Okay, so this is the continuous recycling of carbon and oxygen gas. Now remember, matter can't be destroyed or created, so we have to constantly recycle it, and carbon and oxygen are included in that. So the main way that carbon and oxygen are recycled is through photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Remember, in cellular respiration, we are releasing carbon dioxide into the air, and in photosynthesis, we're going to take that carbon dioxide back out. We eat that stuff, and then it goes back up into the air when we break it down. So that's the main part of the cycle, but there are other factors that are involved with the carbon-oxygen cycle. So let's take a look at those. So what we were just talking about there are biological processes that are going to cycle carbon, like photosynthesis and respiration, and also decomposition. Decomposition puts the carbon back into the soil. But we know that when with respiration we breathe out the carbon dioxide and breathe in oxygen, and photosynthesis does the opposite. So those two are definitely in a very tight cycle. Next up, we have geochemical. This is when carbon dioxide is released by volcanoes. When the Earth used to be very, very, very volcanic, a lot of CO2 was being released all the time. That doesn't happen quite as much now, but that is a source of carbon dioxide that goes up into the air. Okay, so there's our nice little volcano erupting. And remember, when all of those gases are going up in the air, a lot of it is carbon dioxide. All right. Our third way that carbon is recycled is through biogeochemical processes. So this is basically the formation of fossil fuels. So when things die and they end up under the ground, and over millions of years they get compressed down and they get converted into our different fossil fuels like oil, coal, which can get in the oil and the gasoline, all of these types of things end up being our fossil fuels that we can use for energy. That's part of the cycling of carbon through the biosphere, because the carbon is being taken from the life forms that it used to be in and is being converted into these energy sources that we now use. Okay, and our fourth way that carbon is often cycled is through human activity. We tend to cut and burn forests, usually clear cutting to make room for grazing animals, and we also use fossil fuels. In all of these cases, we are increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the air while not taking very much out, and our carbon dioxide levels are at the highest that they have been in many centuries, largely due to the large amount of human activity that is involved with the carbon cycle. All right, so here is just another picture showing you a lot of various ways that carbon dioxide will end up in the atmosphere. You have the volcanoes, CO2 being made in the oceans, respiration from animals, human activity, and the carbon dioxide is being taken out only through photosynthesis, through plants and through algae. So right now we have more carbon dioxide going into the air than is coming out of the air, and that is starting to shift the balance of the gases in the atmosphere and leading to some serious problems like global warming. All right, the last cycle we're going to talk about is the nitrogen cycle. So this is the recycling of nitrogen that has to happen between the atmosphere, bacteria, plants, and then animals. And the reason that we need to do this cycle is that nitrogen is an amino acid, or is needed to make amino acids so that we can make our proteins. So remember, amino acids are the monomer of a protein, and there's our nitrogen right there. It's a major component of an amino acid. And so if we want to be able to make our different proteins, like our muscles and our enzymes and everything else, we need to have nitrogen. And that's the same for plants and bacteria, and all living things have to have nitrogen in order to make their proteins. So our proteins are what you are. All right, so the first thing that we have to do is we have to do a process called nitrogen fixation. The atmosphere is actually mostly nitrogen gas. The problem with nitrogen gas is that we breathe it in and we breathe it right back out. We cannot use nitrogen that is in the nitrogen gas form. So the first thing that happens is that the nitrogen gas that's in the air gets converted into a chemical called ammonia, and this happens by bacteria that can be found either in the soil or on these little nodules that can be on the roots of plants. So there's bacteria inside these little bundles here. And their job is to take the nitrogen gas and change it into ammonia. Okay. Now, ammonia is a chemical that, again, we can't use. Ammonia, think about ammonia as something that's in like Windex or whatever that you would clean with. You can't use that as an animal. So the next step is to do something called nitrification. In nitrification, the ammonia that was made by that first group of bacteria are going to get converted into a different form called nitrates and nitrites. And again, this is going to happen by bacteria that are in the soil. So we've gone from having the nitrogen gas getting converted into ammonia, and now that ammonia is going to get converted into nitrates and nitrites. Now our producers, our plants especially, are able to use those nitrates and nitrites to make their own proteins. So plants can take up these nitrates and nitrites that are in the soil, and they can use the nitrogen that is there in order to make their own proteins. Consumers like us then have to eat the producers, and we take the proteins from the producers and break them down, and then we can use the nitrogen that is in there to make our own proteins. We then end up returning ammonia to the soil through waste and decomposition. Your urine does have a large amount of ammonia in it that was formerly urea, and that is what's going to basically be ending up back into the soil and that will then be also converted by bacteria back into nitrates and nitrites. The plants take them in, we eat the plants, we get our own nitrogen for our own proteins, and the cycle continues. There's one more step that has to happen here, though. The last step is called denitrification, and this is where the nitrates and nitrites that are not going to get used by the plants have to get converted back into nitrogen gas so that they can then be released back into the atmosphere. And this is another type of bacteria that will do this. So there's 3 types of bacteria that are involved in this process. Where we want to take that nitrogen gas, we're going to change it into nitrogen, which can get changed into nitrates and nitrites that we can use. Okay, but whatever doesn't get used is going to go through denitrification and come back into nitrogen gas and go back up into the atmosphere. So it's a continuous cycle that is always going on, but the key thing to remember is that it is bacteria that is controlling this entire process. Okay, so once the nitrates and nitrites are converted back to nitrogen gas, that nitrogen gas can then return back up into the atmosphere. And that's good. The atmosphere is actually about 78% nitrogen gas, so we need to be constantly returning it back to the atmosphere, and then the cycle can start all over again. Okay, so here's another graphic showing you the nitrogen. So we have nitrogen that's in the atmosphere. One of the ways that nitrogen fixation can happen, and this is changing it into the ammonia and the nitrates and nitrites and stuff, is actually through lightning in the atmosphere. But mostly we think about bacteria doing this. So bacteria are going to be doing multiple steps of conversion to ammonia and then to the nitrates. Remember, decomposition and excretion are going to put ammonia back in the soil. That has to get converted to the nitrates and nitrites. The plants can then use those, we eat them, and it just continues on and on. So I'm going to break this down in a slightly simpler type of manner. And if you look at the graphic at the bottom of your page, you can see the circle, and these things go along with each point on that picture. So at point A, this is where we have our nitrogen gas that's in the atmosphere, and that nitrogen gas, as its current form, cannot be used by plants or animals. So we've got an abundance of nitrogen that can't be used by plants or animals. So, through a series of steps, bacteria that are found in various places in the ecosystem are going to change that nitrogen gas into a form that plants can use. It's going to change it to ammonia and then to nitrates and nitrites. And those nitrates and nitrites are things that plants can use. And then the animals are going to receive that nitrogen when they eat the plants. So the plants are making their own proteins, they have their nitrogen, and then we get that nitrogen from the plants by eating them, kind of like how we get our energy from eating the plants. And then the bacteria recycle the nitrogen, returning it back to the biosphere. So after decomposition or excretion, the bacteria that's in the soil is going to then return that nitrogen back up into the biosphere, and then this whole cycle can start all over again. Okay, so what we're going to do is just take a quick look at that picture, kind of showing you where each of these points that we were just talking about. Okay, so at point A, again, here's your free nitrogen. Okay, that free nitrogen can get absorbed into the plants, but it can't get used. So it ends up into the soil. That is going to get converted into a form that plants can use. So there's your form that plants can use. Animals will eat those plants to get their nitrogen. And then the animals return that stuff to the soil either through excretion or decomposition. Bacteria are then going to take that nitrogen that's back in the soil and convert it back into free nitrogen in the air. And those are the basic ways that this nitrogen cycle is going to occur. And remember, the key to this whole process is this bacterial action. It is the bacteria that is doing all of the work in the nitrogen cycle.